Sometimes some media outlets, including YouTube channels, make so many bad arguments in one row that I have to defend people with whom I mostly disagree. So today I'm going to defend Mgtow. Terrible! Okay, let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the Freedom Alternative. Alright, so what I'm about to do is something that I rarely do on this channel. In almost 3 years of activity, I think I've done it twice, maybe 3 times, and only once with another YouTuber, an individual from the United Kingdom who insisted she was a reasonable SJW. No, really, check the other one out. Anyway, this time we'll be dissecting a video that I wanted to respond to the second I saw it, but kept on postponing doing so because I saw it a few days before I went into Georgia and Armenia, then followed other business, then the trip to Cyprus, which I still haven't made a video from. I will, I promise, and so on and so forth. Basically, crowded schedule and the fact that I'm not particularly keen on the topic, considering that I made, in the meantime, far better videos on sexual politics, are the reasons for this very long delay. But all this delay was all for the better. Now that the video I'm responding to is about 5 months old-ish, the instant drama of it died down almost entirely, and thus the risk of me creating more of it is also lower. Which is good. There's nothing we loathe here on the Freedom Alternative more than personal drama. With that said, bad arguments are still bad arguments, and the video by the YouTuber called Genuine Peach is a good opportunity to also clear some things up. I will try my best to piss off everyone. Alright, one more thing before we begin. Please don't flood Genuine Peach's comment section, don't flood her Twitter feed, and genuinely don't ignite or reignite any drama. We're looking at this purely from an intellectual perspective, to the extent that is possible, considering that we're going to hear some really bad arguments, but we'll also hear some good points. So there's that. This video will be very long, and I understand if many of you will think it's pedantic or just simply too long, but I assure you that you'll learn more about Mgtow should you choose to watch it, because it's from the perspective of someone who thinks both Mgtow and Genuine Peach are basically wrong. With that said, let us begin.
And the first thing to remember about Mgtow is that a man that has taken the metaphorical red pill is a man that has learned the ugly truth about female nature. So taking the red pill is making yourself a beautiful how women operate, but the truth is stop women today who rip out your heart and testicles through your wallet.
Hello YouTube, this is Genuine Peach here, and today we are going to be talking about a community who I believe is not particularly fond of women, to say the very least.
Hello Peach, nice close-up effect.
And I just want to apologize to my current subscribers because you all seem like extremely reasonable people, as evidenced by my last video on Anita Sarkeesian. So the reason I am apologizing to you guys is because I believe you are going to have some very interesting interactions in the comment section down below with some very unreasonable people. And I hope the Mgtow community proves me wrong on this one. And for all of you newcomers, make sure to stay tuned to the end of this video for my comments or subscriber highlights. And if you'd like to be mentioned in my next video, make sure to comment and or subscribe down below. I would really appreciate it. Now, you've probably guessed by now that we are going to be discussing the Mgtow community on YouTube. And for you guys that don't know who Mgtow is, stay tuned because I am about to explain everything to you. But
I somehow doubt, though. An unwritten rule in social commentary is to avoid even the implication that somehow what you're about to say is the complete and definitive truth, because you're likely not going to do this, especially if you're talking about current trends that have way too many variables and you are someone who is not involved in almost any of it. This is something to bear in mind for everyone, not just Genuine Peach, mind you. Anyway, carry on.
First of all, I want to make 5 things very clear about my intentions because I have absolutely nothing to gain from this video, and I will show you why.
Yes, you do. There is no such thing as I have nothing to gain. There is no such thing as a completely disinterested party. You can say you don't really give a damn about this topic, and I can believe you. I know I made videos about topics that I didn't really care about, or controversies whose outcome I didn't particularly care, namely that I had no dog in the race. Prime examples being the net neutrality and the DACA video, which I recorded in this very batch of videos. But to say you have nothing to gain is, quite frankly, disingenuous. You do have something to gain. Attention, money from the monetization, maybe more subscribers, maybe even a donation, or why not, some new political friends. Again, there's nothing wrong with that. Though sadly, in the current year, many YouTubers at least try to make it look like it's somehow not kosher to be interested in money and political agitation. But that's the reason you make videos. You don't put so much time into that kind of editing just for shits and giggles. This is somehow a systemic problem with many YouTubers, but that's none of my business. Anyway, please, do carry on.
So, number 1. A large portion of my subscribers are from my Anita Sarkeesian video. Therefore, a lot of my subscribers are males who very much dislike feminazis, just as I do, and may tend to agree with Mgtow philosophies. But let that last video be evidence that I am against the third wave feminism movement, and that I do not identify as a feminist in a first world country, okay?
Okay, I believe all feminism is cancer. First, second, third, fourth, or whatever other form or waves it may be. I also believe all forms of feminism in any country, first, second, third, or fourth, or whatever world you may want, it is still cancer. Nice to have that thing clarified. Carry on.
So I don't want any comments down below saying my opinion is invalid because I'm a feminist and I'm taking this shit personally. That is entirely untrue.
Fair enough, though, as you will prove soon enough, you are taking this shit personally. I suspect it's not entirely your fault, which is why I'm being very calm, and hopefully we can have a live chat sometime in the future on this topic, but nevertheless, be honest with yourself. Anyway, carry on.
Number 2, I won't make any money from this video. Let's just get that out of the way. I have made a total of $15 off of YouTube, all of which I have donated to the Feed the Badger charity.
Now, hindsight is 2020. You've made more than $15 from this video alone. I know because I have on my channel a few videos with as much views as this one I'm commenting on, and I know the rates. Here's a friendly advice from a content creator to another. Don't you ever apologize for that. You have nothing to apologize for. I suspect this is one of the reasons you instinctively lash out at Mgtows, because for all the wrong reasons, Mgtows believe, and we'll get to that as well, they also believe they also have several positive characteristics, let's say positive beliefs even so. One of them being that they never apologize for what they do or for who they are. You could learn that from them, and I'm not joking, nor am I trying to put you down. Anyway, please carry on.
Number 3, I know I'm going to receive a lot of hate because the Mgtow community is very well known for not being able to handle mild criticisms and legitimate concerns, which is eerily similar to a certain person I made a video of. Guess who it is? Guess.
And here's where you go off the rails. The fact that people click the dislike button on your video is not evidence of hate. Let me know when Mgtows create a brigading campaign to report your channel into oblivion or infiltrate YouTube itself to attempt to change its policies so as to automatically censor videos who make fun of or criticize the Mgtow philosophy or individual Mgtows. Oh right, that never happened. And will never happen. And that is precisely the point. The whole horseshoe theory, horseshit, simply doesn't hold water. At all. You can claim it's all the same as much as you want, but for all intents and purposes, you will always be wrong. Because for all the horse manure that many Mgtows do believe, there is still yet to be recorded an incident where Mgtows censored anyone. or engaged in physical violence against anyone, or tried to use the state as a proxy to inflict violence on anyone. That has never happened, and it is inherently feministic to claim that you getting some dislikes on a video is violence. It really isn't. It's called disagreement. Whether you regard it as legitimate or not, it doesn't really matter. It's still not violence, nor is it hate. Also, on a rhetorical level, the worst of Mgtow is still significantly tamer than even mainstream feminism. I have yet to hear or read any Mgtow content suggesting that women should be kept in concentration camps. Meanwhile, feminists say shit like this, and far, far worse, in the mainstream media. And this is one huge problem with your arguments, most of them really. They're almost exclusively based on these assumptions. And your assumptions, Genuine Peach, are faulty. That is, incongruent with reality. Anyway, please carry on.
Number 4, I'm not playing the Nawalt card, also known as the Not All Women Are Like That card, which is meant to make a woman more appealing to men who think that all women are like that, also known as AWOLT. First of all, I don't take AWOLT statements personally. I'm 21, I'm in a happy long-term relationship, I'm not looking to appeal to any men. And if you want proof of that, you can go ahead into my basement where he's tied up and ask him. Just make sure to remove the ball gag before you try to communicate with him, obviously. That was, of course, a joke in poor taste for those of you who did not get it. I don't have a basement, I keep him in the closet.
That was decent. No, seriously, it was decent, though you kinda killed the joke a little bit towards the end. On a more serious note though, your problem is that you're 21. Normally I would have ended the conversation right here, precisely because you're 21. You can claim ageism all you want, but the fact of the matter is that you don't know your demographics and you seem quite oblivious to your limits. And here's why I say this. First of all, the vast majority of men who claim to be Mgtow are about twice your age. Sure, there are a few who are younger, but that's a much rarer occurrence. Most Mgtows are at least 35 and a significant minority are 45 or older. So for you at 21 to come in and tell men who could legitimately be your father, and some of them really your grandfather, for you to try to explain to them how their lives are miserable because you know better is, how should I put this? It's inappropriate, to say the least. I mean, there is something to be said about the old adage that the youth today have no shame. And I'm very serious about this. I'm not Mgtow and I virulently disagree with many points in the Mgtow philosophy, but where I'm coming from, it is considered rude for the young daughter who just got the right to drink a beer without adult supervision to give unsolicited advice to grown-up men. And I can agree that wasn't your intention, but it doesn't change the fact that you didn't take the time to reflect and think a bit before turning on the camera. Heck, I have more years of active smoking than you've been on this earth. And I know they teach you in school and especially in universities that age doesn't matter and whatnot, but it does. Especially when it comes to issues that have a lot to do with experience. There's just no way you can speak about experience on this. Statistics and studies are a separate issue and we'll discuss those soon enough, but this whole, oh, I'm in a long-term relationship and I know what I'm talking about simply just doesn't fly. When I hooked up with my current girlfriend, you were still in primary school. And of course, it's not your fault, nobody chooses when one is born, but the point I'm trying to make here is that it is probably wiser to avoid certain topics until you acquire the gravitas and the wisdom to opine on them. I'm not sure if this point is intelligible to you, but I hope you do think about this at some point in time. Maybe not now, but maybe you'll remember this 5 or 10 years from now when you look back at this. And I say this as someone who started work at age 12 and opened my first business at age 19. So you don't need to lecture me about precocious youth. I know a lot about that because I've been there, but even I had to admit my limits. And that's the first step towards wisdom. Realizing that no, the world is not yours and that there are inherent limits that can only be overcome after a much longer period of time and experience. Now, of course, it is fashionable in the current year to, yes, privilege the voices of the youth as if that's somehow noble and good, but quite frankly that does more harm than good. And with recent research showing that adolescence might actually last till age 24, there is a reasonable case to be made that maybe the voting age should be raised and not lowered. But anyway, more on that in another video. Please do carry on.
And number 5, I want to make it clear that nothing in this video is meant to be a personal attack against you. I want this video to be based on facts and observation, not personal feelings, okay? If anything can come out of this video, I hope that it promotes civil discussion, especially from the Mgtow community. Nobody will be silenced here, even comments like this. But if you do want to resort to comments like this, just keep in mind you are going to look like a fool because the majority of the people on my channel are reasonable adults that like to engage in civil discussion, okay, from what I've seen.
Yeah, not convinced. But I guess it's easy for me to comment many months after the fact. Still, we're 4 minutes into your video and no argument. Shall we get something, please?
Now, the reason I am even making this video at all is because I think the Mgtow community is not helping men at all. And the reason I think this is because this community frequently promotes self-improvement and independence, especially to young and impressionable teenage boys, and it is doing the exact opposite of that in my opinion, and I will explain why later on in this video, so just hang on to your seat.
Yes, I am hanging on to my seat. But for the love of Cthulhu, can you get over with preemptive apologies and get to the meat of the matter? Because we're already almost 5 minutes into your video and only now you've made me interested.
So what is Mgtow? So for those of you that don't spend as much time on YouTube as I do, you probably don't even know what Mgtow even is.
Again with the preemptive apologies, this is getting annoying. Also, let's not pretend it's something so entirely obscure. By the time your video was published, The Independent, The Daily Mail, Vice, The Express, The India Times, The Tab and several other mainstream outlets, not to mention a gazillion of other smaller blogs, have already opined and or presented the topic. There's even a book about Mgtow available on Amazon for less than $4, published in January 2016. A full year before you published this video, The Economist also wrote a piece about Mgtow. Even I have podcasts about this from 2012. You were still not allowed to buy cigarettes when I was talking about this, and I wasn't particularly interested in the topic then either. The point is that when you made your video, the topic was very well known. Again, do try to know your limits and please, very please, stop assuming that the people watching you are stupid or uninformed. Have a bit of faith in your followers. It doesn't hurt, believe me. Let's move on.
So before we go into an analysis of this community, I just want to explain to you what Mgtow is and the different levels of Mgtow. So Mgtow stands for men going their own way, and the definition of Mgtow from Mgtow.com is men going their own way is a statement of self-ownership where the modern man preserves and protects his own sovereignty above all else. It is the manifestation of one word, no, ejecting silly preconceptions and cultural definitions of what a man is. Looking to no one else for social cues, refusing to bow, serve, and kneel for the opportunity to be treated like a disposable utility, and living according to his own best interests in a world which would rather he didn't. This definition sounds very empowering, first of all. The things that stood out to me is that they are living to their own best interests, assuming that they are focusing on their own self-improvements, and that they are saying no, and that they promote independence and self-ownership. All things that can be inarguably respected in my opinion. This definition is very relatable to the original definition of Mgtow, which is by one of the founders of Mgtow, Rob Fetters, from the blog No Ma'am in 2001. And reading his definition, I gotta say he'd probably be ashamed of what Mgtow has turned into on YouTube.
Alright, before you read your second definition, please do allow me to remind you that it is wise to know your limits. First of all, the term going their own way is about 100 years old. It's not an internet phenomenon by any means. There are celibate men described as having gone their way in the mainstream newspapers as early as 1905. And most of the practice is indeed older than that, and I'm not referring here to monks, but simply confirmed bachelors. They've been acknowledged in almost all cultures as having been around for at least 300 years. So to claim that there is a founder of Mgtow on some blog in 2001 is, quite frankly, ludicrous. You really had no idea what you're getting yourself into. Now, luckily for you, most of the people replying to your video were just as ignorant as you were, and indeed many of them even more ignorant than you. So, should you approach the topic again, I would recommend you start reading the collection of historical essays and original documents gathered on the website Gynocentrism.com. It's not perfect by any means, but it's a whole better resource about the history of these things. You will notice that most of these arguments have been around since at least the 1700s, long before feminism was even a wild idea in the mentally disordered head of some forgotten hysterical broad. Basically, what I am saying here is that you showed up to this topic completely unprepared. And throughout the rest of your video, you will prove this time and time again, not recognizing or even being aware about the nature of the topic you attempted to discuss or start a conversation about or whatever. Anyway, please do carry on.
So he states that the original goals of Mgtow are to instill masculinity in men, femininity in women, and work toward limited government. By doing all of that, we make men self-reliant, proud, and independent. We make women nurturing, supporting, and responsible, and we are working for freedom and justice. And something that I found most interesting in the instilling femininity in women portion is that the founder of Mgtow states, "We will hold women equally accountable to men and ignore and shun those who refuse to take any responsibility for their own circumstances. Thus, we induce women to take a complementary position with men instead of a competitive position, as is now the case." A perfectly reasonable request, and one that many in the Mgtow community do not seem to follow, as evidenced by his quote, "Shun those who refuse to take responsibility for their own circumstances." And the reason that I believe a lot of Mgtow followers are not complying with this simple rule is because a large portion of this community is actually blaming women for their own inadequacies, rather than focusing on their own self-improvement as they should.
Oh wow! A philosophy that is fundamentally individualistic has several offshoot schools of thought that don't comply to the T with what you think are the ideals set out by someone on a blog that you mistakenly called the founder of Mgtow. What an absolute shock. Also, even the paragraph you quoted says, "Shun those who refuse to take responsibility." That actually refers to women. So even that paragraph is indeed encouraging blaming women for failing to take responsibility for their lot. So by your own logic, the Mgtows you think you're arguing against are failing to shun women who aren't taking responsibility because they speak about the blame women need to get it for their failure to take responsibility. By that logic, the Mgtows you're talking about are actually nicer than they should, because instead of shunning, they still make an effort to point out what's wrong, which might change some women for the better. Again, this is perfectly consistent with the view you espoused. I don't know if you agree with it, I sure don't, but it is too bad you don't seem to follow the logic of your own statements. Terrible!
This can be evidenced by the countless Mgtow videos that focus solely on the perceived faults of women. Literally search Mgtow on YouTube and you'll find hundreds, if not thousands, of videos with statements in the title like this. I find that very popular words to describe women in this community are liars, cheaters, cunts, idiots, and stupid. Very creative in my opinion.
Yet the only example you gave doesn't include any of those descriptions. You gave an example where the description is gold digger is being used, not the vulgar descriptions you mentioned. Words matter, Peach. And while I totally agree with you that the gross generalizations that do abound in YouTube Mgtow related videos are essentially cancer, I cannot agree with your characterization given the examples you provided. Also, while I can empathize that you may not like being called a gold digger, there is an evolutionary case to be made that you likely are, consciously or not. That's another disagreement that I have with the pigtails, as I like to call the YouTube communities who spend way too much time on this. They regard gold digger as inherently evil, whereas I take the classical conservative view, namely a tragic vision of human nature. By the way, start reading A Conflict of Visions by Thomas Sowell to understand more about that. In fact, you should read all of Thomas Sowell's books. Believe me, it will help you a lot in life. Thomas Sowell is, of course, many things, but definitely not a Mgtow, and I'm very serious about the recommendation. Anyway, so in the tragic vision, one looks at human nature as it is, rather than how one imagines it should or could be. So from a tragic vision or conservative perspective, one takes it as a given that women are hypergamous, because for the most part they are, and doesn't ascribe blame or evilness on it because it's just as natural to women as aggressiveness is to men. Sure, many of the YouTubers who make Mgtow related content are keen on drawing from this fact, namely that most women are hypergamous, and conclude from there that female nature is inherently evil. And I agree with you that they're wrong about that. But you are also wrong in dismissing the claim outright as if it's something funny or not worth addressing. You see, Mgtow militants take a few facts of life and use the incomplete picture that those facts create to draw an ugly image. On the other hand, you refuse to even acknowledge those few facts of life, and instead you draw a picture that bears no semblance with reality. I don't know which is worse, but I do know that you haven't treated the topic with the seriousness it deserves. Carry on.
Anyways, at the end of this article, he states, the men's movement does actually cover a much larger picture. By instilling masculinity in others, as well as yourself, you will actually be improving the lives of everyone, including women and children. And I think that is an extremely righteous conquest, and it shows that he does not seem to hold any bitterness against women. He just wants to promote self-improvement among men and women and the good of humankind.
Yes, but you misunderstood the methods though. Because no Mgtow cares too much about women. The individual you quoted only assumes, and rightfully so, that most of the actions that can be taken by individual men might, or indeed will, change women's lives as well, possibly for the better. But he doesn't offer equal consideration to men and women. And that's not a bad thing at all. Let's move on.
So let's compare the original definition, the definition from Mgtow.com, and the initial goals of Mgtow with those that are most popular within the YouTube community.
And here we finally get to the biggest mistake in the description of your attempt. You are essentially circumscribing the YouTube community to the entirety of the Mgtow philosophy and phenomenon. That, Miss Genuine Peach, is disingenuous. And it's not just disingenuous, it's top-tier leftist-style hit-piece disingenuousness. Even Vice.com did more due diligence than you did. And that's why this video exists, because whilst you're criticizing people that I also disagree with, you're criticizing them from an almost entirely ignorant position which does not forward the discussion, but rather makes things worse. The opposite of what you claim to have intended. And from here on, it gets a lot worse. Play the clip.
And I'm going to use Sandman's description of Mgtow in his video called Introduction to Mgtow, since he is one of the most popular Mgtow channels on YouTube. And the like to dislike ratio shows that his views were very well received from this community. So between 20 to 30 seconds into this video, Sandman... Why does that keep happening? Sandman states that Mgtow are people who have learned the ugly truth about female nature. He claims that many women today, and I quote, will rip out your heart and testicles through your wallet and move on to the next victim with absolutely no second thoughts, and that they often have no guilt or remorse in the process. First of all, I obviously think that's completely untrue.
Really? Why? I mean, it's an odd position for me to defend Sandman here, but extreme sociopathic gold-digging women have been a phenomenon noted in the popular culture since at least the 1500s. Not even Sandman claimed that most women are like that, or indeed that all women are like that. He said many women would do that without any remorse. How is that false? I mean, if you don't believe me, talk to Erin Pizzey. She will give you several tens of thousands of such examples in a heartbeat. Or visit any predominantly single mother area in any Western European country. We can meet up if you want in Stockholm. I'll take you to such places with great pleasure. And you can speak to them. So, while you're claiming that you don't want a feelings-based discussion, your first serious argument is a feelings-based one. You don't think such women exist? I'm sorry, do you believe gravity exists? And this is a serious question. I mean, there is an argument to be made about the proportion of such women. Sandman believes that at least a third of women are like that, whereas my experience tells me it's less than 1 in 10 and only appears to be higher if you stay in a particular type of social bubble. Nevertheless, your answer is factually wrong. Such women do exist, and yes, there are many. Now we can argue how many, but there simply is no argument about the fact that there are many. For instance, a study about preferences in partners conducted in 2006 by the MIT Sloan School of Management, hardly a Mgtow or MRA institution, I hope we can agree on that, showed the following, quote, "For example, while physical attractiveness is important to both genders, women have a stronger preference for the income of their partner than men. We also document preferences to date a partner of the same ethnicity. Our estimation approach allows us to examine the preference trade-offs between a partner's attributes. For example, we calculate the additional income that Black, Hispanic, and Asian men need to be as desirable to a white woman as a white man," close quote. I suggest you do read the entire paper. It has a lot of mathematics in it, but it basically boils down to this. If you're not Mr. Perfect from a physical standpoint, then just make more money. Suddenly, women will love you, by a very far margin. Meanwhile, if you're not Miss Perfect from a physical standpoint, then at the very least, don't be a cunt, and most men will like you anyway. And these kinds of observations are consistent throughout the decades such studies have been conducted. So your dismissal of Sandman's point shows plenty of ignorance on your part. It really does. I can believe that you're not like that, but it's not about you. Let's move on.
That is a very inefficient way of doing it. I would typically go for the heart first to incapacitate them, and then go for the testicles and the wallets after they're dead. You know, it's a little more humane. So for those of you ladies that have been doing it the way he describes it, I don't know where he got this information. It's very inefficient. I would recommend what I have just described to you.
And you lost. No, seriously, you really lost it from this point on. I mean, ask yourself this. For someone who might have possibly stumbled upon your video looking for a second opinion of Sandman's point, what is it likely to happen after seeing your blatant rejection of reality? Will that person be more likely to believe Sandman or less likely? Because while it may seem trivial to you, a significant chunk of men know at least one man who had his livelihood ruined because of a gold-digging whore. And you mocking that with a cheap joke does nothing to prevent the build-up of further resentment. Quite the opposite, it in fact reinforces that resentment. I mean, look, even your average woman who claims to understand why feminism is cancer is still mocking the suffering of men. So maybe those militant pigtails from YouTube have a point. That is what you did looks like from the perspective of the people you claimed are being harmed by the Mgtow message. You're basically correct for the wrong reasons here, because there is a case to be made that many are being harmed by the fueling of the resentment that is being practiced by some of the individuals who make Mgtow related content. But your position isn't helping anyone. If anything, it makes things a lot worse. Do carry on.
He also goes on to explain that there are 4 levels to Mgtow, and I have confirmed via many other Mgtow articles that these levels are generally agreed upon, unfortunately. And I think this level thing is actually a great idea. We should incorporate this system into other ideologies. Can you imagine how easy it would be if people could identify what level they were in their religion? Oh my god, it would make the world a much better place, believe me.
Scientology has levels too, by the way, which is why many critics of Mgtow have compared some segments of it to a cult. You would know that if you had really taken the time to study the topic you're attempting to criticize. For instance, the book Digital Environments, Ethnographic Perspectives Across Global Online and Offline Spaces, published a month before your video was posted by the California University Press and written by 3 German academics and 1 American academic, has an entire chapter about the levels of Mgtow and all the pros and cons with full analysis. My friend Rocking Mystery, a critic of Mgtow before it was cool, also makes an appearance there with his work being quoted at length. But that would have meant you actually knowing what you're talking about and indeed doing the research before you turned on the camera and spending more time reading and less time editing those close-up video effects. Just saying.
So level 1. Purple Pill Man. So this man is aware that women use the governments, the courts, and man's desires to reproduce to take advantage of men. However, this man believes that marriage is worth the potential punishment. So level 1 is where they've almost figured us out, ladies. For those of you who don't know, all us women are in on this massive conspiracy to take advantage of men via their natural desires to reproduce. We actually hold monthly meetings with all of the women in North America to practice ripping out your testicles and heart through your wallets, because that takes an enormous amount of strength and correct angling to accomplish. It's really a good workout for the obliques, because you really gotta put your whole body into it. Oh, and by the way, for all of you women out there, in regards to our last meeting, I didn't see Sally there. I think she is trying to escape us and trying to practice being a decent human being. And that is very concerning. That is not what women are about, Sally. Don't think you can go out and be a decent human being, Sally.
I've heard feminists arguing against this far better than you did. You are again showing such a level of ignorance that I have to defend these people, for Christ's sake. No wonder the wrong ideas of Mgtow's spread that fast. Why wouldn't they, since the most views of its critics are going to such ignorant drivel like yours? First of all, you introduce a limitation that simply doesn't exist in Mgtow, namely the geographic limitation. Mgtow is a global phenomenon, Genuine Peach, and it's not about North America. Believe it or not, the overwhelming majority of relevant things in life are really not about North America. And when it comes to these things, almost none of them are about North America. Heck, feminism is almost entirely a European project, and your country, Canada, is basically Sweden 2.0. Whatever the loons in Sweden cook up, Canada follows in a year or two. See the example of the so-called gender-equal snow plowing. In fact, Mgtow is the strongest in Japan, and the second strongest in India, the third strongest in South Korea. There are more men going their own way in India than there are people in Canada. A lot more, actually. Do you know anything about India? Probably not, as you will soon prove with sources that focus on the tiniest market of all, namely Canada, a country that may have the second largest territory in the world, but with a population comparable to a county in India. Secondly, you don't even know, or at the very least you don't show that you know, what exactly are you criticizing. Mgtows don't believe that there are monthly meetings of women where it is being discussed how to rob men. Nobody really believes that. What Mgtows believe is that there is a system of incentives in place, partly natural incentives and partly socially constructed via governments and other authoritarian institutions, that leads to this happening, with most people, both men and women, being fully unconscious of it. And such a view can be criticized, at least up to a point, but you don't even seem to know that this view exists, and instead criticize a ridiculous straw man. That is not civilized debate. That's crapping on the chessboard and claiming chessmate. Anyway, the video is getting long, so I hope I'll get a cookie or something for putting up with this in the name of clarity. Alright, let's go through a much longer quote. Ready?
Level 2 doesn't have a specific name. I guess that's where the creativity stops, just at level 2. So this Mgtow believes in dating and short-term relationships, but no cohabitation with women whatsoever. Fair enough, I can't live with myself sometimes either. So level 3, no name again for this level. So this Mgtow doesn't believe in dating women at all and limits his interaction with women as much as possible. The thought is inconceivable. He literally cannot believe in dating women, just as an atheist cannot believe in the thought of God. And level 4. So this Mgtow tries to limit his interaction with the state and everyone else in general as much as possible too. He is referred to somebody who is ghosting and trying to stay invisible to women, essentially running away from his problems. And I added that last bit in because women are a problem, right, fellas? I'm sure being a level 4 Mgtow will work out well for you, considering that humans are social creatures and literally go insane without any human interaction. And just in case you didn't know that common knowledge, there are countless peer-reviewed articles you could search up confirming the severe mental and health consequences of social isolation. It's something I definitely don't recommend to my worst enemy. If you can't control your desires against women so much that you need to isolate yourself, what makes you think that you can control your basic desire for human interaction? What makes you think that?
So if there are so many countless peer-reviewed articles, why don't you quote one? Because here's the thing. The scaremongering about loneliness has a lot less scientific basis than you would dare to believe. For instance, the meta-analysis published in 2014 in the Journal of Clinical and Diagnostic Research about loneliness is by far the most authoritative research paper on the topic. And most people read only the abstract, which does indeed sound horrible. It says, quote, "Loneliness can lead to various psychiatric disorders like depression, alcohol abuse, child abuse, sleep problems, personality disorder, and Alzheimer's disease. It also leads to various physical disorders like diabetes, autoimmune disorders like rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, and cardiovascular diseases like coronary heart disease, hypertension, obesity, physiological aging, cancer, poor hearing, and poor health. Left untended, loneliness can have serious consequences for mental and physical health of people," close quote. Now that sounds horrible, right? There's just one problem. All of these problems are specific to old people in general, who I am sure, just by pure coincidence, also happen to be likely the most lonely because, you know, biology. The spouse dies, the children leave to build their own lives, and so on and so forth. However, when comparing the results to elderly people who are not lonely, the results are also similar. Again, because biology. Old people tend to have sleep problems, Alzheimer's, diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, hypertension, physiological aging, cancer, and generally poorer health. Again, because biology. Moreover, the authoritative study itself acknowledges that, quote, "However, most of these studies were done in elderly patients," close quote. So basically, you're relying on research made on people who are already likely to have many of these issues and then conclude that it's only because of loneliness. That's just not how science works. Also, while I agree with you that the level of loneliness proposed by the so-called level 4 Mgtow is not a good idea, your rebuttal is incredibly weak. After all, Mgtows don't say that their philosophy in general, or the level 4 in particular, are for everyone, or that it is desirable for everyone to adopt specifically the level 4, so you basically rebutted an argument that they didn't make. What an average Mgtow will say is that level 4 is extreme, and it's definitely not for everyone, but it is a good option for certain individuals for sure. And that is an argument you cannot refute, because it is irrefutable. There have been several notable figures in history that were essentially level 4 Mgtow, even though this specific terminology did not exist or was not particularly known. One such example is, of course, Nikola Tesla, who is famously quoted as having said, "Be alone, that is the secret of invention and progress." Tesla was essentially married to his work. So while he would fit our definition of lonely, there is no question that Tesla loved loneliness. Now, of course, you can say, well, most men aren't Tesla, which is of course true, but then again, the Mgtows don't say that this lifestyle is for every man. So while you say you wouldn't recommend this to your worst enemies, you're basically making a value judgment of a lifestyle that you simply don't understand, let alone empathize with. In other words, you're making an argument from ignorance based on your feelings. That, your genuine peachness, is terrible. Believe it or not, a significant chunk of men are what we would call today introverts. There are 4 types of introverts: social, thinking, anxious, and restrained introverts. And most Mgtows are predominantly anxious introverts. Again, there's nothing wrong with that per se. It's some of their ideas that are not particularly great, but your rebuttal doesn't help anyone. And your presumably clever question, quote, well, if you can't control your desires against women, your words not mine, so much that you need to isolate yourself, what makes you think that you can control your basic desire for human interaction, unquote. This is a question purely on feelings and rife with assumptions that are simply not common. I would recommend you watch a TED Talk, again, hardly a Mgtow institution, about the power of introverts. There is a much larger segment of the population that many dare to admit, for which the opposite is actually true, namely that they have a basic desire for a lack of human interaction. And it actually correlates by sex, namely that there are more men than women who function like that. Or put it another way, women are far more miserable when they're lonely than men are. And this, of course, makes perfect sense. Since the dawn of the human race, young men have had to endure long periods of loneliness. Being alone in the woods trying to hunt, sometimes for several days in a row, was the absolute norm for young men in the early stages of human evolution as Homo sapiens sapiens. So it is thus no surprise whatsoever that men have evolved to take loneliness much better than women. This is also reflected in the cultural stereotypes that survived the test of time. The stereotype of the needy and clingy wife or girlfriend rings instinctively true for most people of both sexes, whereas the image of a needy and clingy husband or boyfriend is frowned upon, partly because it's rare and partly because historically it has been very unproductive for the species for men to crave human interaction that much. And by historically, I mean over the course of the last 200,000 years or so. So, you see, while you may think, or may have thought, that you've made some very clever and definitive points, your arguments are guilty of the exact same thing you're accusing Mgtows of, namely a complete and utter lack of nuance, wisdom, and knowledge about human nature. And it gets worse.
And it's totally fine to promote this sort of lifestyle to other young men that don't know what they're talking about in their pre-teens. They definitely won't regret it when they grow up and realize they can't even hold a simple conversation with anybody.
As opposed to a 21-year-old who totally knows what she's talking about and is purporting to teach men twice her age about how it is better for young men to live their lives, right? I mean, seriously, Peach? Can you not see the irony at play here? At the very least, Mgtows purport to teach their experience to younger men, flawed as it may be, but at the very least they're trying to provide younger men something that the feminist system destroyed, namely male role models. To believe that you know better is, I'm sorry to say, preposterous. You can't know better unless you've been involved in the raising of a teenage boy, either by being a mother yourself or being closely involved in the education of the son of a friend or another relative or anything in that ballpark. Have you? Because if you haven't, you really have no idea what you're talking about. For the record, I have more than once. It's a very illuminating experience. It taught me how little I had known previously about this whole thing. Also, your female nature, to borrow from the Mgtow lingo, is on full display here. You're overemphasizing something that is really quite irrelevant for most men. Oh my god, if they do this, they might not be able to hold a conversation in certain circumstances. Yeah, so who cares? Men don't. The most important men of recent history sucked at conversations. Heck, the founder of the Virgin Corporate Group is an illiterate dyslexic. The founder of Facebook sucks at conversations big time. He pays a personal trainer to help him mimic being an extrovert that is thrilled to be among people. But he hates it and sucks at it. That didn't stop these men from being successful, including being successful with women. You're basically making a set of assumptions that are simply not universal at all, and in fact are quite outliers when it comes to the demographic that Mgtow panders to, namely young white men and young working class men of any ethnicity and race. The stereotype of the 30-something or early 40s father who is mostly silent when coming home from work and carefully observing the household as the kids run around is a stereotype precisely because it's much more common than you would think. And most men look up to that and would prefer to be that. Meanwhile, your assumptions go in the opposite direction. Your implicitly stated preference is for yuppies, young men who are very extroverted and thrilled to mingle with lots of people and whatnot. Now, there's nothing wrong to have this preference, but it is very wrong to assume that it is universal or preferable, because it's neither. Now, I do realize that this filth we jokingly refer to as modern culture has been encouraging this kind of attitude in which we're all supposed to pretend we like people. And I do realize that maybe many individuals ended up liking that, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Still, a significant chunk of men, and I would dare to argue indeed a majority, aspire to the taciturn archetype. Also, considering how men are treated in universities these days, the taciturn archetype is preferable even for men who may otherwise be extroverts. Essentially, on this argument, you pulled a Mgtow on us. You took one fact of life and used it to paint a picture that bears no semblance with reality. Yes, humans are social creatures, but that does not mean at all that humans are inherently extrovert or that the need for social interaction is really that high. Talking to a friend once in several days is more than enough, especially for the leave me the fuck alone types, who are also the core demographic of Mgtows. Okay, let's move on.
Because it's good to teach people to be a victim and run away from their problems. It's part of self-improvement, people. You gotta get woke and isolate yourself from society.
Now, in this straw man, you did hit, and I would argue accidentally, a good point. One of the legit criticisms of particularly the YouTube variety of Mgtow is indeed its undertones of victimology and victim mentality. With that said, your straw man is still a straw man. A straw man that ends with a not-so-subtle form of man up, because that is surely a useful message to people whose stated purpose is to oppose such garbage. A man up to a Mgtow has just as much effect as it has on a female feminist to tell her to get the fuck in the kitchen and make me a sandwich. Describing Mgtow as running away from your problems is basically telling them to man up and face those said problems. There's just one problem with this. You're wrong. And there's an entire book written by an acclaimed clinical psychologist to explain to you why you're wrong. If you haven't read it, please do hit Amazon.com and order your copy of Men on Strike, Why Men Are Boycotting Marriage, Fatherhood, and the American Dream, and Why It Matters by Dr. Helen Smith. In the book, she will explain to you in very candid terms that men avoiding this mess are not running away from the problem, but indeed engaging in completely rational behavior that is both positive for the men in question and also not overtly harming anyone else. And the reason I bother telling all of these is because I want more people to get informed before they open their mouths about this topic. Because clearly, Genuine Peach, you haven't gotten yourself informed, neither about the ideology you want to criticize, nor about the science and the experience gathered in decades of practice. I understand the youthful impulse of screaming out loud why you're right and everyone else is wrong. Believe me, I really do understand that. I also thought, foolishly, that I had all the answers and everyone else was fucking dumb for not getting it. But then I started traveling more and reading a lot more, and realized that it's not everyone else who is dumb and not getting it. Let's go further.
So looking at these different levels with the definition given by a well-known Mgtow, it is safe to assume that the goal of the Mgtow community on YouTube is to try to avoid women, and with a little bit of mental gymnastics, you may come to the conclusion that they want to focus on their own self-improvement by doing so. Little bit of mental gymnastics. They don't want to be used by women because they can't help but succumb to their own sexual desires, and women know exactly how to manipulate such desires and use the gynocentric government in order to, quote, enslave these poor men.
An almost impeccable description, though again limited to a tiny portion of the YouTube Mgtow segment. I haven't seen you addressing some more profound arguments put forth by YouTubers such as Barbarossa or Stardust. Again, individuals with whom I had virulent disagreements, but individuals who are definitely a lot more serious and profound than you make it be. Also, you gotta be aware of the notion of clickbait. And the old adage of not judging a book by its cover. I mean, just because a video is titled "Men are slaves," it does not follow that the uploader actually believes that. I mean, just saying. Also, your sneer at the term gynocentric is really misplaced. You said you follow the honey badgers and donated to their channel and operation. Well, how about you ask my good friend Karen, also a subscriber on this channel, to tell you a thing or two about gynocentrism. Also, the term and the practice of gynocentrism predates feminism. It's not something with which YouTube Mgtows just came up with out of nowhere. The practice of gynocentrism can be traced back to the early 18th century, several decades before things like the Seneca Falls Manifesto were written. Auguste Comte, French philosopher and founder of the discipline of praxeology and the doctrine of positivism, postulated the gynocentric worldview as early as 1829, and by the 1840s he had an entire practice, i.e. a praxis, as in praxeology, the discipline he founded, based on what he called the cult of the woman. Auguste Comte, again, is hardly a Mgtow. He is also responsible for the existence of the concept and the term sociology. You would have known this if you had bothered to do your research, but you didn't. So there's that. The point is that gynocentrism is not some imagination of Mgtows. It is a perfectly acceptable and accepted scholarly term to describe most of the legal practice in the current year. You might also want to familiarize yourself with the works of scholars Paul Nathanson and Catherine Young, authors of a scholarly work called Legalizing Misandry from Public Shame to Systemic Discrimination Against Men, published by McGill Queen's University Press. Again, very mainstream source and hardly the work of Mgtows or MRAs for that matter. Let's carry on.
And it's kind of hypocritical of Sandman to say this sort of thing when he made a video called How to Use Women? ? You know, fight fire with fire, even though there's no fire to begin with, and you're just gonna fuck up your own life.
Blah, blah, blah. Sandman is not Mgtow. Sandman is one dude.
Anyways, I did some more research into this community through many articles that I will cite down below.
You ended up citing exactly one, and also some vague references to the CDC and Statistics Canada, and also a source from an academic journal, but with no DOI or direct links so we can check it out as well. Terrible! Anyway, tell us what your research yielded, because so far it doesn't really look good at all.
And there are so many conflicting views on the subject on what a Mgtow actually is. And I've seen Mgtows go against each other depending on their own definitions, kind of like feminazis.
Fair observation, though unlike feminazis, Mgtow doesn't purport to be a unifying view, and that's precisely because it is individualistic at its core. Also, if there's one thing you should have learned from YouTube is to never take YouTube comment sections too seriously. Anyway, carry on.
Anyways, here are some examples. Some people will follow the original founder's message and actually focus on their self-improvement rather than avoiding women. Some will get married, but it will be on their own terms. Some will get married regardless of whether it's on their own terms, but accept the consequences. Some will remain celibate, presumably by choice, as they like to claim. Some isolate themselves completely from everybody, even though the original goal is to just avoid women. and some have a lot of sex with women, or so they claim through anonymous, pictureless internet profiles, but never have relationships. And there are many more I can explain, but it'll take too long, and I don't want to dump your head with more of this bullshit, for lack of a better term. Maybe they should make a concrete Bible of some sort so we can actually know what their goals are, other than watching clips of stupid people on YouTube who happen to be women. Because that's part of self-improvement, right, fellas?
So basically, you want them to be more like feminists or Scientology. Are you sure you want that? Otherwise, you have what you have correctly identified is by far the least objectionable part. The clue is in the name, going their own way. And when you think at this through the inherently individualistic perspective that this is all coming through, it should be perfectly easy to figure out why you have disparate outcomes. It's an admission that each man's own way is, well, his own. How's that hard to grasp? It helps to get it once you drop the assumption that they're just like feminists. Sure, they have some similarities, enough of them for me to dislike most of the thing, but overall, Mgtow is an individualistic philosophy as opposed to an ideology. That's why it yields different results on different individuals. And there's nothing wrong with that. Jesus Christ, again, no wonder their appeal is getting better. With critics like these, the sky is the limit for Mgtow. Let's carry on.
Anyways, let's run through the points that the Mgtow community on YouTube is trying to make and see if it correlates with their initial goals for the avoidance of women and self-improvement.
So 16 minutes into your video and the plethora of unsubstantiated claims, outright wrong claims, and a gazillion ignorant assumptions, you finally get to the point. God help us. Please, by all means.
These points that I have gathered are based on numerous videos that have surfaced about these topics, the popularity of said videos, and the large like to dislike ratio of these videos, so we can assume that they are well accepted. So number 1, marriage and child support laws are unfair towards men. First of all, I 100% agree. The family courts are definitely positioned to be more favorable towards women, and I honestly would be scared to get married as a man in this day and age. And that's why I understand the reasoning from the level 1 and level 2 Mgtows. If you want to see proof of that for yourself, go to Statistics Canada and look under child support statistics and alimony. An example can be that 19% of people of an unknown gender are paying child support when they had equal custody. You'll also notice that 93% of women are the people receiving the child custody checks. Therefore, it can be safe to assume that at least 15% of men pay child support when they have equal custody.
So you agree that the system is gynocentric. Okay, maybe we're getting somewhere. Do carry on.
So now that we've established that fact, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to petition, spread awareness of the situation, have civil discussions about it like an intelligent and reasonable person, or make and watch stupid shit like this on YouTube that doesn't help anyone?
Why not both? I mean, you do realize that a certain segment of the Mgtow sector is also actively supporting the efforts you just described, right? If you don't believe me, ask the honey badgers. They will know for sure. Also, I took a careful look at the examples you presented and called them stupid shit, and as it turns out, most of those videos are essentially news segments or small commentary on certain news items. How's that wrong? Also, on what basis do you assess that news and commentary is stupid shit that doesn't help anyone? You would be surprised how many young men are indoctrinated in schools to believe that essentially female criminals don't exist. Heck, the mainstream media is overtly promoting the idea that women's prisons should be abolished, and this is while everyone knows that female criminals are less likely to go to jail to begin with, no matter the crime. Or in plain language, women get away with a lot of horrible shit simply because they're women. And this is a global phenomenon. There's not a single country on earth where women get equal punishment to men. Even in Islamic theocracies, this is still the case. Most female murderers in Iran, for instance, get out from jail in about 10 years after being incarcerated. Most male murderers in Iran get hanged from a crane. For more on that, I will recommend the work of Ali Mehrashpan, university professor in Iran, who has been writing about sexual politics in Iran for several years now. And this ignorance is further augmented, including by yourself, Genuine Peach, with ignorant postulates like feminism is not needed in a first world country, with the implication that is needed somewhere else. Such ignorance leads to the mainstream media presenting the execution of a rapist, pedophile, and sadistic torturer as a tragedy, simply because the rapist was female and a citizen of Saudi Arabia, where punishment for pedophilia is beheading in a public square. So it is thus unreasonable of you to simply postulate that individuals publishing videos about crimes committed by women is somehow not useful. It is very useful, particularly for those who might still be tempted to believe the disdainful nonsense that women don't commit violent crimes. They do, and increasingly so, as a matter of fact, and people documenting that and helping to quash the mythology are indeed very much needed. Also, let's not pretend that ceteris paribus even exists here. Heck, you are living proof of that. Your video that we're dissecting now is full of huge mistakes, yet it gathered a lot more attention than a video with a civilized discussion about the evils of gynocentrism. The point being that civilized discussions have been going on for quite some time, even before your grandparents were born, to be more precise. The book The Fraud of Feminism is a very civilized treatise on how evil feminism is. It was published in 1913, 115 years ago. No one cared. And most Mgtows are aware of all this, and they contend that civilized discussion has failed and thus no longer worthy of pursuing. Now, I agree with them on this topic. Where we differ is that I propose an agitprop solution to the issue, whereas Mgtows simply recommend giving up. What you propose is simply doing more of the same, expecting different results than in the last 120-something years, which is the very definition of insanity. Let's move further.
So number 2, probably the biggest point that Mgtow is trying to make. Marriage and divorce will make you miserable, so it's better to stay single. I know it's not really common knowledge, but I will explain it all to you soon, right after I take this drink. Now it's completely your choice to not get married. Nobody is putting a gun to your head, okay? Even women, we will only rip out your heart through your testicles and wallet, so you don't have to worry about that. But let's just look purely at the facts and not your own personal experiences, okay? According to this survey of 160,000 people by David Cameron, he found that people who were cohabiting or married were happier, less anxious, and found more life satisfaction than any other group. However, you'll notice that the most miserable people are divorced. And granted, there's a good chance that you may divorce and find yourself at point number 1. However, is there really a good chance that you're going to divorce and be miserable? Is the world really black and white?
Considering that the most susceptible group to commit suicide by a very far margin are middle-aged, recently divorced white men, yeah, it kinda is black and white, to be quite honest with you. Also, the survey you quoted, do you happen to have the methodology? If you do, please send me an email so I can evaluate that. If anyone else watching this has this information, please do send it to me. And the reason I'm asking for this is because surveys have a core set of inherent flaws, as well as being susceptible to a certain avoidable but nonetheless common flaws. I'm interested how the researchers tested against the latter. In plain English, I'm interested how did they define happiness. If they define it as liberally as possible, or even worse, left it entirely to the attitude and feelings of the respondent, then the survey is entirely garbage. So what if it has a 100,000 sample? If the premise is garbage, the result is also garbage. You know, garbage in, garbage out is a principle that expands beyond the IT sector. Just saying. Secondly, how was the data gathered? For instance, did people fill out the surveys on paper or electronically? Was it tested for median differences in responses, depending on whether the spouse was in the room or not? Serious question. Of course, the best way to do this is to avoid gathering the data, is to do the data individually and anonymously. But did these researchers do any of this? Maybe they did, I don't know. And Genuine Peach doesn't tell us. And the answers to these questions matter for the overall relevance of the survey, which he uses several times in the video. Also, you yourself admitted that you wouldn't get married if you were a man. So then to quote this survey and ask if there's really a chance to get divorced and end up miserable simply doesn't fit with your previous statement. You either agree that the system is rigged or you don't. If you agree, as you said you do, then it simply follows that you understand why marriage is a bad deal for men. If you don't agree, then your next argument with the survey makes sense. But you can't have them both, unless you're going to seriously argue that it is worth the risk of exposing yourself to the worst possible outcome just because you might be slightly happier than being single until you get divorced. So is that what you're going to argue?
Okay, so first of all, you'll notice that the happiness levels of divorced, widowed, and single people are not that far off from each other. And marriage wins by a long shot in terms of happiness and self-fulfillment. But is it worth the risk? Because you have a 50-50 chance at either being extremely happy or extremely miserable. Well, let's look at the facts. Many may come to the false conclusion that 50% of first marriages and 60% of second marriages end in divorce based off of a survey in the 1970s. If you do the research, it is now clear that divorce peaked in the 1980s at 40%, and it actually went down in the early 2000s to 30%. And if you don't believe those statistics, you could go ahead and go to Statistics Canada or Statistics US or whatever you guys have over there, and it'll show the exact number of divorced people and married people, so you can do the math for yourself. According to Fertility, Family Planning, and Reproductive Health of U.S. Women, data from the 2002 National Survey of Family Growth, which is the most recent I could find, the divorce rate for first marriages for women between the ages of 15 and 44 was 30% within the first 10 years of marriage. However, nearly 1/2 of these divorces were from women who married younger than 18 years of age, and only 20% of those who married 23 years of age or older. 20% of that 30%. So already, if you marry a woman 23 years of age or older, which I highly recommend, you have a very good chance of not getting divorced.
So 30%. Okay, that's 1 in 3. This is seriously your argument? Oh, it's not 1 in 2, it's actually 1 in 3, and if you crunch the numbers the way I tell you to, it's actually 20%, so 1 in 5, and that's a good chance, believe me, I promise, I swear. I'm not a Mgtow, and I find this argument to be utterly insane. 1 in 5, considering that the overwhelming majority of divorces are initiated by women, is actually terrible for men. Also, you do realize that marrying older women defeats the purpose of marriage, right? I mean, if a man gets married, he will want children. Also, since you're so much into statistics and on the levels of happiness, let me throw some of my own. Statistically, people who marry young are happier, especially if the woman is significantly younger than 23, preferably 19 or 20. So basically, it is the way you stated the first time. It's an edge between extreme happy and extreme misery. And by that, I mean an enormous likelihood of the man ending up killing himself. Also, if you're so much into crunching numbers, how about you compare single men in their late 30s with married men in the late 30s? You'll have some surprises. You'll notice that the single ones are happier. Could be because by your late 30s as a man, you're getting closer to the peak of your earning potential without having to support someone else. And that can be really nice. Sure, it doesn't work like that for all individuals, but people do self-select on these issues regardless of whether they know Mgtow exists or not. Because you need to bear in mind, most men who could be reasonably considered Mgtow don't even know the term Mgtow even exists. And they don't have to. Anyway, carry on.
But let's not stop there. Let's look at the causes of divorce. So the fact has been true for 125 years that women want divorce more than men. This can be evidenced by 25 different data points over 125 years that are summed up in this article called "These Boots Are Made for Walking: Why Most Divorce Filers Are Women." And let's keep in mind that the courts and social norms were sure not in women's favor in regards to divorce 125 years ago, to say the least.
To say the least, you have no idea what you're talking about, as in, at all. Or as President Donald Trump would put it,
Wrong. Wrong.
That is
wrong. And he did the wrong thing. Wrong.
That is absolutely
Wrong.
proved over and over again.
Wrong.
He actually
Wrong. It's wrong.
They were not hired, and here's why he does it this way. Let me explain why he hires.
Jeb is so wrong. He said no. Wrong. Wrong.
national debt
Wrong.
advocated.
Wrong. With that money, he lost one.
Very nice words, but happens to be wrong.
I would recommend you read the book The Legal Subjection of Men, published in 1896, 122 years ago, by Ernest Belfort Bax, a highly experienced attorney in England. The book has about 500-ish legal cases from the period between 1890 and 1895, showing systemic, clear and consistent bias in favor of women in divorce courts and other court-related matters. Also, you can look up for the many protests that took place against unfair alimony rulings in divorce courts all over Europe and North America throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The article you are seeing on the screen right now appeared in the Los Angeles Herald in 1921. Such protests were a matter of routine in both North America and Europe. The difference is that in Europe, they yielded some changes for the better. In North America, nobody cared, and things have gotten progressively worse in the last 100 years. In fact, in North America, the biggest supporters of the men's rights movement in the 1920s and 30s were female judges, which is an aspect you won't hear too often mentioned, especially in civilized and respectable circles, where the completely false view that such disdainful cancer like first-wave feminism was genuine, legitimate, and needed. No, it wasn't. It was just as cancerous and harmful as third-wave feminism. So no, genuine peach, the scales of divorce have been tipped in favor of women for a very long time. You have swallowed the militant femo-fascist, propagandistic and revisionist view of history, which has as much to do with reality as the flat earth theory. Now, you might have been well intended with this video, but we're 22 minutes into it and you've only made 2 fair points and been consistently wrong on everything else. Now please, by all means, hit me with the apologia on why it is okay for women to ruin marriages by filling between 2/3 and 98% of the divorces in any given year in the last 125 years. Go!
So maybe they really wanted that divorce. And let's look at the reasons why they would want that divorce today, where the perceived benefits are in their favor. Now, when looking at the causes for divorce in 2014, which is the most recent data set I could find, it's hard to say it's entirely the woman's fault, really, as many MGTOWers like to claim. 37% of women divorce their husbands because of emotional abuse, compared to 12% of men.
Okay, stop right there for a second. You do realize that emotional abuse is mostly a fiction, right? As evidence for that, I would direct you to look up how many people, regardless of sex, have been convicted or issued fines for emotional abuse. You'll find the number quite tiny, and that's because emotional abuse means whatever the claimant wants it to mean. The way this works is like that. One partner goes to the other, look, I want a divorce, and by and large, there are 2 ways from there. The first is the other partner saying, okay, fine, and they jointly sign the no-fault divorce papers, and that's pretty much it. However, if the other partner says, no way, we're fine, I actually don't want to divorce, then the partner who wants a divorce needs to file a reason to speed up the process. And here you have a small but relevant chunk who make up shit. Here are all the cases of false domestic violence and all the rest. I'm sure you've read about that. However, most don't go that route, but instead fill in emotional abuse, knowing full well that nobody will question them for the details and the other partner also won't be questioned that much, but also won't be allowed in a court to say no to the divorce. So yeah, that's the emotional abuse claptrap. On average. Also, let's not forget that some states, jurisdictions, or countries have highly extremist definitions of what constitutes emotional abuse. For instance, if I tell my wife that she should not use the phone to make a phone call overseas today because our phone bill is already too high, and she should instead wait for a few days until the next billing period commences, that is, legally speaking, a form of emotional abuse in several countries, such as my own, or Sweden, or France, or Italy, and also most US states, such as Alabama, Vermont, Indiana, California, and a few others. The reason I'm mentioning all of this is because most people really don't know this. And here, it is not always the fault of women, as you correctly identified, Genuine Peach, but it is the fault of the family court lawyers who, emboldened by perverse incentives, advise their female clients in particular to pull this adversarial crap for the benefit of the lawyer. And most women, like most people indeed, don't know about this and go along with it because they trust their lawyer. And that's how you get to that number that you quoted, Genuine Peach. Okay, let's go further.
29% of women divorce their husbands because of alcohol or drug problems compared to 14% of men, and 21% divorce their husbands because of physical abuse compared to 7% of men. Now, does this mean that I think that all men are horrible people that abuse women and regularly use illicit drugs and alcohol? No. And you know why? Because I'm not a fucking idiot. So we can conclude from these actual statistics and not your feelings/personal experiences that women have reasons for divorce other than stealing your heart and wallet through your testicles, and about 21% get out because somebody is literally beating the shit out of them.
Sure, there are other reasons for divorce other than women being insufferable whores, but that doesn't refute the argument you are trying to refute, Genuine Peach. At best, this little rant refutes the all women are bitches crowd, which is not really a big crowd anyway. But this doesn't refute the more nuanced claim that you set out to refute, namely that the odds of divorce are too big and the consequences of divorce are often fatal for men. That is the claim. You telling me that whatever percent of women are getting a divorce because they're beaten doesn't address the question at all. And yes, it's women, not woman. I've been resisting the urge to correct you on this, but come on, it's a persistent mistake, and you're speaking in your native language, whereas I'm speaking in my third language. Focus a little bit more. Also, let's not take those stats at face value, because again, they are heavily relying on claims and not so much on evidence. Have you ever been to a women's domestic violence shelter? If you haven't, please do pay them a visit and grab their flyers and read for yourself. You will notice that almost all of them encourage women to file charges regardless of the truth. And they're pretty open about it, citing how easier it is to get a divorce just because you said he beat you, or even that you're afraid that he might beat you. You don't need evidence. Your word as a woman is enough. And the so-called patriarchal system practices listen and believe as well. Of course, there are cases of women filing for divorce because their husband is indeed beating the living shit out of them. But are they 21% of all divorces? Come on, nobody believes that. I'm willing to bet. Not even feminists believe that. Ask any divorce attorney about these stats, and in an off-the-record conversation, they will candidly tell you how those statistics are happening. But again, even if I listen and believe to everything you just said, that still doesn't address the initial argument. And that's kinda sad. 23 minutes in, and all your attempts to get to the meat of the matter ended in failure. Sad.
You are not innocent or evil in a divorce because of your genitals, okay?
Oh yes, you are. Check out the custody statistics while we're at it. Or the stats you yourself quoted earlier with men paying child support even though they have equal custody. Your own evidence doesn't support what you just said. Again, for more on this, please do see the work of Erin Pitti. She has about 50 years of experience with women and domestic violence, as well as lies in divorce courts. Any book by Erin Pitti on this topic is preferable. Again, Peach, you're criticizing from a position of ignorance. For the vast majority of this video, so far 23 minutes, you ranted without saying anything substantive. Your video is a prime example on how not to approach any topic related to sexual politics. I should probably check out your video on Anita Sarkeesian too. I'm sure I can mount a defense for Sarkeesian as well if you approached her lunacy with the same level of brutal ignorance as you approach this topic.
And we can also conclude from these statistics that you have an extremely high chance of not getting divorced and living a happy life if you marry a woman above the age of 23, don't beat the shit out of her, and don't abuse alcohol or drugs.
I'm not even going to bother with this part. You want it to be clever, but this is very far from clever. See, this is what happens when youthful hubris runs amok. Carry on.
And if you do decide to do any of those things, which I don't recommend, you still have over a 70% chance of staying married for at least 10 years in your first marriage.
Well, that's not good enough, Peach. At least you corrected your mistake while editing, so kudos to that. But it's still not good enough. Almost 1 in 3 chance of divorce after 10 years of marriage is in fact quite terrible. Especially when you correlate with the fact that I mentioned earlier, namely that white middle-aged men recently divorced are by far the most at-risk group of suicide, outpacing even transgenders. And guess what? Recently divorced middle-aged men are exactly those who divorce after 10 or 12 years of marriage. It is devastating. It is quite literally a carnage. So if this is your best argument, then you already lost. The Mgtows don't have to say anything in response, just post your arguments and that's enough to make the Mgtow case, goddammit. Because if a cure had only a 70% chance of completely curing a fatal disease, while it would kill the rest of the 30% of the patients, any serious researcher would conclude that it is ethically superior option not to distribute the cure to the market to begin with. The same happens here. If we accept that married couples are happier, which I don't really accept, but for the sake of the argument, if we accept that, and we also accept that recently divorced men are very likely to kill themselves, and we also accept that there is a 30% chance of ending up in the situation of killing yourself, then really not marrying at all is unquestionably the superior option. I don't think you realize just how big of a number 30% really is. Imagine you have 9 male, very close friends of yours, and all of 9 of them are contemplating marriage. That means, for sure, 2 of them will be dead before the year 2030, and another one might die, or at the very least end up in some form of rehab or psychiatric institution because of the devastation of the divorce, while the other 6 will be fine, possibly slightly happier than they are now. Would you be willing to choose who dies and who doesn't? Would you, knowing all this, advise any of them to get married? Serious question. Let's hear some more.
Also, let it be known, if you stay single, you have a very high chance of being miserable according to a national survey of 160,000 people compared to married people by a long shot. You are basically in the same position as somebody who is divorced or widowed.
Actually, that's a lie by your own standards. Your evidence shows that single people are better off than those divorced or widowed. Look at the graph. I didn't make the graph. You came up with it as a supporting evidence. Also, you are committing the mistake of assuming that Mgtow is an American phenomenon. It isn't. Or that the national survey you quote is representative, which we don't know, for the nation it is made on, presumably the United States, but again you don't tell us that. But even if we assume that the survey is impeccable, it still doesn't say much about the rest of the planet, you know, about the overwhelming majority of the planet, that is. For instance, I would be interested to know how things look like in China, a country that is slightly less gynocentric than the global norm, and also a country where it is inevitable that about 80 million men will necessarily end up single because, you know, there aren't enough women to go around for all men. Would the same trends would this as in the United States apply? I don't know. I suspect they won't, but I don't know. And watching your video, Peach, doesn't enlighten me or anyone else, because 24 minutes into your video you've been attacking a straw man and came up very short in anything even remotely comparable to a sensible, civilized, or compassionate analysis. Heck, you haven't even quoted your own chosen evidence consistently, yet you stay there and state authoritatively that you can explain what Mgtow is and why it's wrong. 2/3 into your video, you have decisively proven that you can't. But hey, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you will enlighten me somehow. So please do, take it away.
And it's much easier to make the choice to stay single. So if you decide to stay single and say, I never want to get married and I never want a long-term relationship, you have a very, very high chance of being in that category. So looking at the facts as a man, you have a much higher chance of being happy and fulfilled getting married than somebody who is single and has a similar happiness level as someone who is widowed or divorced.
Again, none of that is true by your own standards and evidence. Not to mention, you still haven't explained how you or the researchers you are quoting are measuring happiness. Believe me, it's not an easy task. That's why such surveys need to be taken with a huge pinch of salt. You have failed to show even the most basic level of skepticism here. You lecture men twice your age about how not to think with their feelings. This is really shameful.
You'll also notice that 30% of men divorce their wives because of infidelity compared to 27% of women. And we will take that on to our next point. Point number 3. All women are dishonest / cheat more. Let's start with dishonesty. I have yet to see any solid evidence from this community and elsewhere that women are more genetically predisposed to dishonesty.
There is no such evidence yet. However, there is a lot of evidence that women do indeed lie more than men. The feminist explanation for this observed fact is this: well, women lie more because women are nicer. No, seriously, that's how feminists explain away the fact that women lie more. Surveys that queried even further about lies found that the most common place where both men and women lie is at home. The difference is that women lie 30 times a day or twice every waking hour, whereas men lie on average about 5 times a day. Is that genetic? I don't know. I don't think it is. But when chalking something to nature, it doesn't just mean genes, you know? Nature is a little bit more complicated than that. Nature is also hormones. It's also immutable environmental factors, i.e. factors people cannot manipulate, and other aspects that are also part of nature and not socially constructed. So just because there is no genetic explanation for why women lie more, that doesn't necessarily mean it is not part of the quote-unquote female nature to lie. Other studies have shown that exposing individuals, both men and women, to testosterone correlates heavily with an increased degree of honesty. Now, does that mean that testosterone is the elixir of honesty? No, not necessarily. There are other factors too, and most of them have not yet been researched. But this is another piece of the puzzle nobody has yet been able to solve. And this is the problem with many Mgtows. They take one fact, such as the correlation between testosterone and honesty, and then blow it out of proportion to say, well, here's definitive evidence that women are basically a bunch of lying cunts. That approach is, of course, brutally insane and unscientific. However, you do that too, Genuine Peach. You take the fact that there is no serious evidence of genetic predisposition of women to lie, and use that fact to then imply that any argument concerning a natural propensity of women towards lying is basically garbage. That approach is also unsound and unscientific. You and Mgtows are made for each other in this department. You both approach science worse than a freaking British tabloid.
From the peer-reviewed articles that I read, I have come to the reasonable conclusion that dishonesty may have something to do with nurture rather than nature, and especially when the nature portion concerns the sex that you're born with. Find me one peer-reviewed article, just one, that suggests that ovaries, estrogen, and an extra X chromosome makes you more prone to be a liar.
As I said, the absence of evidence does not mean the presence of evidence for the opposite claim. Your argument here is basically like the creationist argument. Well, if you can't prove beyond doubt that God doesn't exist, therefore God obviously exists. So just because someone cannot prove something in your terms, that doesn't necessarily mean that the opposite claim is true. Also, when it comes to these things, it's usually a mix of nature and nurture. It is fundamentally wrong for you to simply claim that it's just nurture because you read some articles that you didn't quote for us to review, by the way. That's not how science works. Science asks questions and shies away from offering such categorical answers, Genuine Peach. For a sample, look at a discussion about the so-called gay gene. Nobody in serious scientific circles anyway is going around claiming, oh look, we've been looking for a gay gene for decades and since we haven't found conclusive evidence of it existing, then it must mean homosexuality is socially constructed. Or when recently something that might be the gay gene was discovered, all of the interviews with the researchers are on a skeptical and or conservative tone, using a lot of, well, we don't know yet, we can't be sure, and of course the obligatory much more research is needed. So for you to come out and say you have single-handedly concluded that the propensity towards lying is entirely socially constructed because you read some what you claim to be peer-reviewed articles, that, Miss Genuine Peach, is hubris. In addition to being fundamentally wrong, because the fact of the matter is that you don't know. I don't know either, but I'm not the one claiming to know everything about everything. Basically, what I'm saying here is that you should try to be more humble. There are limits. And I genuinely hope you do watch this video entirely, because it is in your best interest to try to be more humble in the future. Sure, at this point, you'll probably dismiss most of what I just said, but in a few years, you might remember. Anyway, carry on.
Now on to the cheating portion. I'm sure many of you MGTOWers have noticed with your tunnel vision that 30% of men divorce because of infidelity compared to 27% of women, which is a huge difference, that 3%. But let's look at the statistics of who actually cheats rather than who divorces because of infidelity. I have found one of many studies that conclude that men cheat more than women. In fact, it's about a 4% difference in one study, and that's the lowest I could find. But the difference ranges from 4% to 15% in all of the studies that I've looked at, all leaning towards men cheating more. In fact, on ashleymadison.com, a site for extramarital affairs, over 18 million accounts are married men when compared to only 3 million being married women. However, do I think that all men are cheating scum? No. And you know why? Because I'm not a fucking idiot. Again, your own personal experiences and feelings are not evidence that all women are like that, alright? It's impossible for all women to be like that, just as it is impossible for all men to be like that. If you want to come across as somebody who wants to be taken seriously, use evidence and reason, not your feelings.
Speaking of evidence and reason, the Journal of Sex Research published about a month before you made this video a study titled I Swear I Will Never Betray You, Factors Reported by Spouses as Helping Them Resist Extramarital Sex in Relation to Gender, Marriage Length, and Religiosity. The study concluded that in a marriage between the year 6 and 10 of the marriage, women are far more likely to cheat than men. And this is the evidence that is relevant for the topic you are discussing, Peach. Because while it is true that overall men cheat more often than women, in the context of the perils of divorce and the confines of marriage and reasons to get divorced, the situation is different than the general trend, which is also confirmed by the statistical evidence you offered, with men citing infidelity more than women. So we have pre-factum and post-factum evidence. And also, adultery is no longer a felony or even a crime almost anywhere in Europe and North America. So unlike other reasons, there's a much stronger foundation to trust those men and those women to tell the truth when they cite infidelity in legal papers. Or in plain English, neither men nor women gain anything if they lie about their spouse's affairs in the court. So neither men nor women lie that much about it. Hence, we have a rational reason to believe the stat that says that more men file for divorce because of infidelity than the other way around. Also, in the same study, it has been found that men are more likely than women to cheat while married only after the year 11 in marriage. Or put it another way, men get bored slower. Women get bored after 6 or 7 years of marriage, hence the popular theme of the 7 years itch. Whereas men get bored after 11 or 12 years of marriage. Again, this evidence was available to you when you made your video. That is, if you had been interested in the pursuit of truth rather than the pursuit of the creation of a high-pitched rant that does a lot more harm than good.
Point number 4, and the last point I'm going to run through. Men are enslaved by women. Not to be a feminist, but search up the normal treatment for Middle Eastern women today and the 640,000 girls today that are being forced into sex trafficking, and then tell me it is women's nature to enslave men with sex.
Sure, I'm glad you brought this topic up. So, let's take a look at certain facts, shall we? The typical minor victim of human trafficking is a boy, by a very far margin. This makes perfect sense. Girls are trafficked almost exclusively for sex purposes. Boys, on the other hand, are used not just for sex purposes, but also for labor purposes and, of course, as child soldiers. Translation. While it is indeed horrible what is happening to women and girls, men and boys in the exact same areas have it significantly worse. For starters, they have a third of women's survival rate. Now, you might also want to look into the phenomenon called bahabazi, a practice whose victims are 100% boys that continues to be tolerated to this very day for one reason and one reason only. The victims have the wrong sex. While the trafficking of women, either for sex or for other purposes, has been almost eradicated in Afghanistan and is punishable by lapidation or life imprisonment, the trafficking of boys for both labor and sex remains widely tolerated because the United Nations could not care less about what happens to boys. Speaking of the Middle East, even the feminist charities and the feminist newspaper The Guardian had to acknowledge that since the war broke out in Libya, the victims of rape have almost exclusively one sex, and that sex is male. And you'll be surprised to learn that the rapists of those men are of both sexes. And when women don't rape men in Libya, they make sure the male victims of rape are entirely ostracized and expelled from the community, resulting in many of them killing themselves or simply dying of starvation, or more likely, dehydration. You want me to go on? For instance, in the Syrian conflict, it is widely quoted that about 35% of the women detained for various reasons during the conflict, either inside Syria or Iraq or as refugees in Jordan or other places, about 35% of the women were sexually abused. Are you curious what is the number for men? According to the feminist newspaper The Guardian, citing UN Human Rights Council personnel, as well as their own reporters who conducted these extensive interviews in the refugee camps, between 30 and 40% of the men were also sexually abused. But you don't hear that part of the story on TV. I would also once again direct you to the articles of Ali Mehrashpan about the divorce laws in Iran, which are quite far from what you might be inclined to think, Genuine Peach. In fact, it is much more dangerous and financially ruinous as a man to get married in Iran than it is in Canada. The English language media only looks whether the laws are gender neutral, and if they're not, then they just assume that women have it worse. In reality, it's slightly more complicated than that. For instance, I do suggest you look up the concept of mehriye or mahr, which is a concept that exists all over the Islamic world except Bosnia and Albania, and I guess Kosovo. I'll learn that soon when I get there. After you looked that concept up, please also do look up how divorce is allowed under Sharia law. And no, it's not as easy as saying I repudiate you 3 times, as far too many seem to believe on all sides of the political spectrum. Mind you, I'm very far from being a friend of Islam, and this channel is a testament for the complete lack of love that I have for Islam, and that is, to put it mildly. But ignorance like the one you display on the topic, Genuine Peach, really doesn't help. Speaking of ignorance, do you have any idea how family income is divided the Quranic way? It's pretty much like this. Women's income is women's income. Nobody, not even her husband, has any claim to any of it. Meanwhile, men's income is the family's income. All of the man's female relatives have a claim to his income. And in some countries, such as Saudi Arabia for instance, it is explicitly in the law and vigorously enforced by the notoriously harsh Saudi courts that the man himself is the last one to be allowed to claim some of his own income. Now, how's that for patriarchy? Islam is cancer precisely because it makes everyone miserable, and with trivial exceptions, whatever bad thing you may find as happening to women, you can safely bet that in the exact same area, a lot worse things are happening to men. Again, with trivial exceptions that are not even statistically relevant for the Middle East, let alone for the globe. I'm also willing to provide you with a lot of reading material on this, should you be interested to challenge the myopic and factually wrong perspective that you currently hold about the sexual politics of the Middle East. Because unlike you, I actually went there. That's how I learned about half of the things that I know. Alright, so now we looked a bit where you said we should look, and after looking, you said we should come back and tell you that it's women's nature to enslave men with sex. Well, I won't tell you that because I don't believe that. However, I do believe that in most countries, including most of the Middle East, the social and political structures are permissive enough to allow women who want to use their sex to enslave men to do just that, essentially with impunity. And again, it's a lot worse in the Middle East. For instance, in Iran, if she divorces you, you're in for a long period of essentially indentured servitude, because you gotta pay her about $300,000 in a country where the average working man's wage is $200 per month, that is. So much for the Middle Eastern patriarchy. So while I agree with you that the Mgtow claim that the women generally use sex to enslave men is an extreme claim that is not supported by evidence, I also disagree with your sneering and your dismissal of the issue as if it's a fantasy. It's not. It's a reality for several tens of millions of men, if not more, worldwide. Most of them are in India, and India is a category in and of itself. I would suggest you spend a few dollars on the documentary Martyrs of Marriage, made by a very nice lady. Her name is Deepika Narayan, just so you get a glimpse about how marriage actually is in India. Spoiler alert, it is entirely different than you think. I really do deserve more than one cookie for this video, really. Anyway, carry on.
However, let's not take any of that meaningless information about women's nature into consideration, and let's just look at first world countries. This community frequently claims that women enslave men by marrying them and making them work to support them and their children, or that women take advantage of men via his natural desires for sex. A lot of this community quite literally thinks that there's some sort of conspiracy that all women are in on, and if you don't believe me, watch this video by Howard Dare. This thought process is so interesting.
Considering how many times you are wrong or even outright lied in this video so far, I'm very afraid to say what I'm about to say, namely that I trust your word that the video indeed claims what you say it claims. A voice in the back of my head tells me not to trust your word after 27 minutes of mostly wrong and generally ignorant claims, but I also don't want this video to exceed 2 hours by too much. So reluctantly I will trust your word that the video claims what you say it claims, and if that is the case, I agree with you that it is an insane position to take. With that said, I know for a fact that there are quite a few Mgtow YouTubers who most definitely don't believe that, and instead believe that women simply don't give a shit and thus make no effort to control their urges and allow themselves to be entirely guided by primal urges on this issue. Now, this is a view that also has its own flaws, but it's a lot harder to refute than the easy cop-out that you have just laid out. And one of the reasons it's harder to refute is because its first statement is true. As a rule, women don't give a shit about men as a rule. You are primary evidence of that. 28 minutes into your video and there have been exactly 0 moments in which you hinted, let alone expressed, a genuine compassion for men. Your video is one of the most sociopathic videos I have seen in the last 6 months. Mind you, I don't blame you that much for that. In fact, I prefer honest sociopathy to fake compassion. But I'm just saying that if you take into consideration the other view that I just laid out, you might have serious troubles refuting it. And this video is getting too long, so I won't do it for you. Let's move on.
First of all, women have desires towards men as well. Women have desires to reproduce. Women will do stupid shit when they are in love just as men do. Like, have babies. Babies trap women too, you know? It's not like we just pop them out and you take care of them. That's not how it works. Our bodies go to shit. We get stretch marks. We are in extreme need of dependency in terms of finances and emotion, and we would like a father figure for our children. So it's not just men that get trapped here, okay? It's not a favorable situation on the surface for women as well.
All true, but as usual, you forgot some details. As the law stands right now, everywhere in Europe and North America, mothers have rights, fathers don't. At all. Women have options, men don't. It is unacceptable to tell women that if they don't like it, they should not spread their legs, but it is totally acceptable to tell men that if they don't like it, then they should keep it in their pants. This double standard has been around since forever. But for the most part, men accepted it because they had some trade-offs. Yes, men would have had to bear with those double standards, but in return they would get authority over the family, respect in the community, authority over the children, and custody of the children. All of these perks have been obliterated. So now men have the same responsibilities, but none of the corresponding rights, all while being told every day what a bunch of oppressors they are, and are being reminded every day about how great equality is, but only if it benefits women. Otherwise, of course, it's misogyny. So in plain language, if the woman gets pregnant, she has all the rights. He has no rights. If she wants to kill the baby, commonly known as abortion, he has no right to object because her body, her choice. However, if she decides to keep the baby, he also has no right to object. His body being consumed for the next 18 years to produce the shekels for child support is of no relevance for anyone. You said it yourself. Oh no, women get stretches. Terrible. How many stretches do men get laboring for 18 years to raise a child that they may not even have wanted? And under the threat of debtor's prison in the case of the United States, mind you. Do you care? Of course you don't. But then don't act surprised when some men decide not to care either. You, with this attitude, are part of the problem, and as far away as possible from being part of the solution, Genuine Peach. In the current year, as per the legislation, women's inconveniences for 9 months are valued as far superior and worthy of total protection from even the slightest annoyance than men's inconveniences for 18 or 21 years. And I'm pretty sure you believe that's totally fair, although you'll probably never admit that in public anytime soon. That is where the Mgtows are coming from. And while their prescriptions are sometimes disagreeable, you dismissing the male experience as simply not too important makes you a good argument for why Mgtow is necessary. So while you can stay in your chair and say that it's not a favorable situation for women, do keep in mind that's not how most young men see it. And the young men do have a point. Because while it is true that being pregnant and taking the pregnancy to term and delivering it is not pleasant and not the most thrilling and favorable thing in the world, women have had over 250,000 years to biologically evolve precisely so they can manage this. Meanwhile, men didn't have 200,000 years to evolve to adapt to brutally misandric laws that have become the norm in the last 40 years. I guess the only thing that I can appreciate is your honesty. We can tell from your tone and physical posture that you genuinely believe that what you're saying is totally fair and not in any way uncompassionate and brutally misandric and ignorant. Let's go further.
Women can also get taken advantage of by horrible people just as men can. Love is a drug. As Howard says, love does make you blind. But what he's wrong about is that love is not a condition that only men suffer. Like, I can't believe I'm even trying to convince a huge group of people that women have the capability to love. Can you imagine? How fucking blind can you be?
Strawmanning much? I mean, granted, I didn't watch Howard's video, so maybe he is that stupid as you claim he is, but you're missing the larger point, Peach. You are of course correct that women can also be taken advantage of and that love is not a condition that only men suffer from, to use your language. But the point is that women have a multi-billion-dollar industry to take care of them. And that industry is, by and large, paid for by men. Because as I'm sure you know, over a lifetime, only men pay taxes. Women cost the government more than they contribute. Again, as a group, in general, there are exceptions. So while most of the needs and most of the wants of women are covered by the largely male taxpayer cohort, none of that exists for men. You talked earlier about loneliness. Well, let me tell you something about loneliness. Married men are the loneliest people imaginable. For a multitude of reasons, and yes, some of them being men's own stupidity, mind you. Married men do not retain a support network after they get married. The reverse is not true for women, by the way. But even women who don't retain a support network, there are always resources for women in need. Always. For men, well, not so much. And by not so much, I mean statistically zero. I mean, what, there are 4 countries in Europe that have domestic violence shelters for men and another 4 that have mixed shelters. In North America, no such thing exists at all. So for the vast majority of men in both Europe and North America, if they are being domestically abused by their wife, there is nowhere for them to turn for help. In fact, if they turn to the police, they stand a grand chance of being arrested themselves because the police is instructed that women who abuse their husbands, well, essentially don't exist. Even though domestic violence is much more evenly split than most people are willing to admit. And for that, I would direct you to the vast scholarly work conducted by Dr. Murray Strauss on the topic. So that is where the Mgtows are coming from. Sure, some of them are loons and assert some really insane things, but the bottom line remains that when problems occur for women, there are a ton of resources to alleviate those problems. When problems occur for men, nobody gives a shit. Or even worse, when men try to raise the issue, they get the exact same response that you gave. Oh, but what about the women? You know, it can happen to women too. Yes, Peach, I know it can happen to women too. And I'm sure most Mgtows know too, although I agree with your general point that there are some loons out there as well. But for the vast majority of time, nobody argues that this cannot happen to women. What many do argue is that the response is radically different when it needs not be. Carry on.
Now I want to go into my last subject about how the Mgtow community is eerily similar to the feminazi community. I know this is a sensitive subject for all of you Mgtows because you believe that Mgtow is fire and feminism is gasoline or some bullshit like that. But before you get your panties in a twist, please hear me out on how many similarities your community has with the third wave feminist community. So here's an article by Matt who brings up an interesting point about feminism and Mgtow. There was a feminist movement in the 1970s by somebody named Andrea Dworkin who argued for political lesbianism and that feminists who dated men were fraternizing with the enemy. Similar to Mgtow, who are swearing off of women in general.
Yep, finally you made a cogent point. Yes, it is indeed the case that lesbian separatism, and also political lesbianism, by the way, is quite similar to some versions of Mgtow preached on YouTube, which is why I'm very fond of labeling it Pigtow, because it's basically mudslinging. Anyway, carry on.
Although I haven't seen any Mgtow beliefs that support homosexuality among their community, which I think might do them some good as they are very obsessed with women, I think there may be some parallels here.
Why? No, seriously, why? I really do hope you watch this video and maybe we get to talk about this, because I'm very curious. Why do you think it would be good for Mgtows to promote homosexuality? Are you suggesting that homosexuality is, or at the very least can be, socially constructed? Serious question. I'm not trying a gotcha moment here. There is no wrong answer to this question, but I would love to hear your answer. Anyway, please carry on.
Number 1, they both hate the opposite gender. Both extremists in these groups preoccupy themselves with the obsession of the opposite gender. And again, this is evidenced by the countless Mgtow videos on YouTube that are solely about women and how horrible they are, similar to the feminazi community who dedicates their lives on convincing people how horrible men are.
Again, your examples are simply news items. So if I make a video about the crimes of tall and left-handed people, does that mean I hate tall and left-handed people? I mean, I'm sorry, but your examples are just not good enough to make the point you're making. Also, even if I accept your thesis, and I do accept it partially, as I know there are indeed Mgtows who legitimately hate women, though much fewer than you would think, I would still insist on nuance, as I said earlier. There is no Mgtow equivalent of Julie Bindel. Julie Bindel believes and openly argues in The Guardian and on TV that all men should be in concentration camps. None of that exists in Mgtow. Also, Julie Bindel is working tirelessly to free up as many female murderers and rapists as possible. None of that exists in Mgtow. The closest thing to pro-male judicial activism is an attorney in California who sues venues that advertise women-only events. But that's it. There is nothing in the entire pro-male space that would even suggest, let alone actually do, investing time and resources into freeing up men who everyone knows they are guilty of murder or rape. Yet such thing exists in the feminist community, and it even has some success. For more of that, see my 2015 video, Feminists Were on Fun and Human Nature. Let's carry on.
Number 2, cannot handle criticism and gets triggered easily.
Saying these things directly to you and they're saying them directly to you, that's a whole other level of harassment, really.
It's a very similar thing to Anita Sarkeesian's behavior. My point will probably be proven very soon in the comment section down below and in the like and dislike bar on this video. I have already agreed with the level 1 and level 2 Mgtow's reasoning and have agreed with them on how unfair marriage laws are for men. But I assure you, you will see some comments down below where they are getting their panties in a twist because I don't believe that all women are horrible people, which is a very unreasonable thing to expect anyone to believe. Also, if you do end up agreeing with them completely as a woman, they will still hate you because you're playing the Nawaltz card and think that you are trying to seduce them by saying you're different from the others or some bullshit like that, because it's a massive conspiracy here.
I can't believe you don't see the irony in comparing the Mgtows clicking the dislike button with the reactions by Sarkeesian. You just pulled a feminist on everyone here, Peach. Once again, someone clicking dislike is not hate, nor is it evidence of belief in Iwalt or any of that. It just means they didn't enjoy your video. Also, not everyone clicking dislike is a Mgtow. I am a good example. I clicked dislike on your video because of the many wrong things you said, especially in the first 27 minutes of your video, not because I was triggered by your video. I can assure you that I could not care less. I watch daily programming from far left content creators, so what you're putting out is easy peasy, believe me. Anyway, you're once again short on nuance. When Mgtows disagree with you, they click dislike, they maybe even leave a nasty comment. At worst, they make a response video, maybe even a bad one, an unsubstantiated and ranting video, granted. But that's the extent to which they would go. Sarkeesian tried to get policy passed at the United Nations because some people disagreed with what she said on YouTube. Can you not see the slight difference in nuance here? Also, please do let me know when Mgtows release someone's private information and tries to get them fired from their job simply for their contrarian opinion. And I insist, Mgtows doing that, not MRAs, not generic anti-feminists, not skeptics, no. Mgtows in particular. I looked up closely and could not find any example. There are dozens with feminists doing that though. The point is that even when they're brutally wrong, and they are routinely, Mgtows are largely harmless outside YouTube comment sections. So to compare them with Anita Sarkeesian is, quite frankly, an exaggeration on your behalf. Yes, there are some similarities in initial impulse, that's certainly true, but overall in the reactions, not even by a long shot. Carry on.
Number 3, driven by emotion and not reason. This can relate to my last point. They frequently bring up their own personal experiences with women and videos like this as proof that all women are bad rather than actual facts and reason. And here's something that I think a reasonable person would suggest to the Mgtow community. If you think that all women are horrible and every single encounter that you've had with women had gone horribly wrong, then maybe, just maybe, the problem isn't with half of the world's population. Maybe it's with you. And the chances of that statistically are extremely high.
Finally, an argument that makes sense. Entire sense, mind you. Yes, it is undoubtedly true that a certain segment of the YouTube Mgtow circles are like that, and yes, there is no question the problem is likely them and not women in general. Please do carry on.
And number 4, pushing their beliefs onto children. Feminazis do the exact same thing, and I'll explain that later on. The most concerning thing I've seen in the Mgtow community is them passing their beliefs onto their unsuspecting children. Many of you may be confused as to how they could possibly have children if they're Mgtow and don't believe in having kids or getting married. Well, these particular Mgtows are divorcees with children, and I'm going to take an educated guess and say that they might be a little bit bitter about their divorce. Anyways, I've come across quite a few people in the Mgtow community that want to pass the teachings of Mgtow onto their sons and daughters, which is sick in my opinion. I saw one particular person ask in a comment section, how do I get my daughter to not grow up to be a bitch? It kind of reminds me of this article where this feminazi believes that her sons are rapists even though they're good kids and have done nothing wrong. Same exact thing.
Come on, Peach. We were getting somewhere, and then you come up with this. First of all, the feminazi you're referring to is probably the Australian best-selling author. Let that sink in. You're comparing a known bigot with a huge audience and influence with someone in a YouTube comment section asking a question. Or maybe you're comparing the other loon from the US that I made a video about who writes for the Washington Post. In any event, both are highly influential when compared to the average dude writing a YouTube comment. Secondly, the feminazi in question believes her son is a rapist. The individual you're talking about believes his daughter might grow up to become a bitch if not properly educated. Can you not see the difference here? Also, what is exactly wrong with asking around what to do to prevent the worst possible outcomes for your children, namely your daughter to become a gold-digging whore and your son to become a cuck? Any parent should want their daughters to grow up to become responsible adults and not bitches, just like any parent would want or should want their sons to grow up to become responsible adults and not cugs or thugs or bullies. That's a perfectly reasonable position for any parent to take. And considering that that chap's daughter will grow up in a world where women, and only women, have the unilateral power to destroy a man's life through a simple accusation, it absolutely does stand to reason to consider, as a father, ways to teach your daughter to be responsible with that power and be aware of the damage it can do should she chooses to use that power irresponsibly. None of that is wrong in any way, nor is it sick. Please do carry on.
I personally think that it's not right to push religions onto children, but teaching your sons that women are bad, therefore they should never get married and have a better chance at a happy life statistically, is sick. It's also worse to teach your daughters that they're horrible people, because you're not going to raise good people if you keep telling them that they're horrible.
But you don't know that was the individual's intention. All you know is that he asked, what can I do to prevent my daughter from growing up to become a bitch? That's all you know. And whether you agree or not, it is a perfectly legitimate question. Just like it's a perfectly legitimate question to ask, what can I do to prevent my son from growing up to become a thug? You labeling this perfectly normal parental concern as being sick says a lot more about you than the individual in question. You see, that's why you should learn to be more restrained and less categorical. You don't know everything. And some of the things you cannot know yet. You will know them 10 years from now, I assure you. But until then, it's much more wrong for a young girl to call normal parental concern of men twice her age sick than a grown-up man expressing parental concern. Also, you're making quite a huge leap without the corresponding evidence. You're assuming that individual will teach his daughter that she is horrible, even though from the quote you offered is evident that he doesn't believe that. Instead, he believes that without proper guidance and education, his daughter might grow up to be a bitch in the future, not that she is now. So you're basically hearing what you want to hear, or read, whatever, and not what the individual clearly wrote. Carry on.
Now, I have the opinion that adults have the right to do whatever the hell they want with their lives as long as it's legal and not hurting anybody else. However, you should feel ashamed to even think about bringing children into your messed up life. You can be Mgtow, but leave the kids alone, okay?
Why? Who died and made you queen to dictate what's okay and what's not? Because last time I checked, there is such thing as the unalienable right of the parents to educate their children however they deem fit, unless they harm them physically. And here's the thing, as an atheist myself, I would rather have children be educated by evangelicals than be educated by someone with a personality like yours in the current form. And I say in its current form because I do hope that you will learn more and dial down some of your completely unearned overconfidence in topics you obviously know absolutely nothing about. And you talking about shame is the icing on the cake for sure. A young girl, still mostly a child, explains to men twice her age about shame. That is essentially female privilege. Young men are taught better to open their mouths only when they know beyond reasonable doubt that they're right, and sometimes not even then, if they're facing a man far more experienced than themselves. It's called honor. It used to be instilled in women too, but with the rise of the self-esteem movement, that has been wiped away. A 21-year-old man speaking like that to his 42-year-old father would appropriately get a slap on the face for being rude, impertinent, and presumptuous. Just saying. Please, by all means, do carry on with your presumptuousness.
And this isn't because I'm scared that I will have less potential mates when those children grow up and that my children will probably have less potential mates, assuming I'm going to have a daughter. That's not it. And if you think that, you're sick. You need to get that checked out.
Okay, I'm pretty sure nobody thinks that. You're ascribing way too many reasons and intentions to your critics' genuine peach. Not everyone disagreeing with you thinks you're an evil, manipulating bitch. Some of us just think you're wrong, and you have too much of an attitude without the corresponding knowledge to back up that smugness. I chalk that up to poor upbringing. You clearly lack the necessary temperance and sobriety necessary to have this conversation. No wonder the strongest female voices in the non-feminist community are all older women. Young women of today seem to need a lot more time than previous generations of women to acquire that balance and temperance necessary in order to not be so damn rude. And I'm not saying this to make you feel bad, although to be perfectly honest, I don't give two hoots how you feel. I am saying it in the hope that you will at least consider that maybe, just maybe, not everything is about you. Not everything revolves around you, and no, not everyone who might possibly disagree with you is an idiot who believes there's a conspiracy of all women to oppress men. And very important, not everything in life has to include women, or even consider women. There are things that are better to be left alone as they are male only. And just because you disagree, that does not make your opponent sick. It really doesn't. And finally, your last point.
I want to end with this message. I am of the opinion that you should never take advice for your own happiness from miserable people, because they have no fucking idea what they're talking about and they do not wish for your well-being. Looking at this community on YouTube, I can very safely come to the conclusion that these are not happy and secure individuals. It's alright if you don't want to marry, if you're into short-term relationships, etc., etc., although I don't recommend that lifestyle to people who want a better chance at fulfillment and happiness in life. Nobody is putting a gun to your head. It's wrong to blame the opposite gender, or anyone else for that matter, for your own inadequacies. It is also wrong to obsess over your confirmation bias by watching bullshit videos like this. It's absolutely ridiculous to assume with no evidence that it is women's nature to be liars who are there to take advantage of men. Just as it is wrong for feminazis to do the same shit about men. Mgtow claims that feminazis made them into what they are, and yet they act just like them. That's why nobody takes you seriously, and that's why men who are actually successful and who are alpha males never label themselves as Mgtow. Stop trying to pull people into your social isolation and do something with yourself. Also, I will probably be doing a follow-up video if I receive a lot of questions, because others will probably want to know your thoughts since they may be thinking the same thing. So feel free to comment.
And then she goes on and on with some shout-outs. We can safely skip that. Okay, Preach. I heard your final message, and I completely agree with the message that one should not take advice from miserable people. I don't agree though that Mgtows act just like the feminazis, because they really don't. Sure, some of them obviously have similar instincts, but they are very, and I mean very, far away from even being capable of acting like feminazis, let alone actually acting like feminazis. Again, you're making leaps of logic that are simply not sustainable by available evidence. Also, while you are correct that miserable people have no idea what they're talking about and they do not wish for your well-being, you also proved for 35 minutes in this video that by and large, you have no idea what you're talking about either. Even worse, you postulated completely unproven things and presented them as scientific fact. Earlier, you said that women's higher propensity towards lying is due to nurture because you read some, quote, peer-reviewed articles, unquote. I'm sorry, Peach, but that's just horseshit. You also say nobody takes Mgtow seriously, yet several dozens of mainstream publications say differently. They took them seriously enough to write a series of articles about them, including quality press like The Economist. Heck, you took them seriously enough to make a long video about it. When I don't consider a topic to be serious, I don't make a video about it. That's why I don't have videos about the validity of young earth creationism, for instance. Because I can't take that stupidity seriously. Mgtow, on the other hand, even though it's a topic on which I have disagreements with, particularly on the solution side, is a topic that I consider to be very serious. And the press agrees with me. Heck, some governments are starting to agree with me, such as the government of Japan and South Korea, which are now working tirelessly to convince young men and young women, in the case of Japan, to get back into the dating and marriage game, because otherwise there will be no Japan anymore. If you think that's not serious, you need to think harder. You also need to put a lot more maturity into this topic and really think it through, because the way you looked at things in this video is very superficial. Just because you discovered a few insecure/unhappy individuals in the admittedly superficial research you did, that does not make their arguments not serious. You need to work more on this. Work on separating the individual making the argument from the argument itself. You're also saying that it is wrong to blame the opposite sex. Well, you say gender, but that's really wrong. Gender is an ideological construct. We're talking biology here. So you're saying that, and this is a direct quote, it is wrong to blame the opposite gender or anyone else for that matter for your own inadequacies, close quote. Now sure, stripped of context, that is clearly true. However, in the context, your statements comes off as cruel, mean-spirited, and yes, sociopathic. Because while some Mgtows on YouTube believe brutal nonsense and have some insane ideas about what to do about it, the fact remains that many of those inadequacies have, at least in part, external causes. Sure, we can agree it's not the fault of all women, or maybe even not the fault of most women. But at the end of the day, most of these men have been raised by a deeply feminized system that told them that anything feminine is great and preferable, and anything masculine is to be derided at best or destroyed and medicated at worst. This is particularly true in your country, in Canada, where drugging young boys into submission with Ritalin, causing irreversible brain alterations, is still, to this day, the absolute norm. And who has the most control over the education of children? The guardian of children has a sex, and that sex is female. Yet the overwhelmingly female group of people that takes care of children has been, and continues to be, very silent on the abuses against boys and men. So you cannot, in good conscience, sit there and tell me that everyone else, that the outcomes of the status quo are entirely the individual fault of individual men who might end up with some inadequacies, whereas women bear no responsibility whatsoever. These things just happen to them. Adopting such an attitude is, in addition to being ignorant, very cruel and really wrong. Because no problem can be fixed without first getting some broad acknowledgement that the problem exists. And your attitude doesn't help. In fact, it makes things worse. You're not helping to steer away other men from pursuing Mgtow. You're providing additional reasons for them to do so. I mean, seriously, if I were Mgtow, and specifically a Mgtow popularizer or propagandist, I would simply re-upload your video with a more clickbaity title and maybe apply a few overlay texts on some points, and that's pretty much it. That will be enough for a one day of work in the service of popularizing Mgtow. Because while you steered clear of pulling the Nawalt card, as you put it, you did pull the rest of the cards that feminists usually do. You used shaming tactics, you practiced Darvo, which is a deflect, attack, and reverse victim at offenders. For instance, when you claimed that it's men's fault that there's so much divorce and end up killing themselves. And of course you pulled the what about the women card consistently, ignoring that those problems are already being addressed systematically and systemically when they occur to women. And the whole point of conversation is to emphasize that they're not being addressed at all when they occur to men. Ultimately, time will tell, and you will know it. If 5 years from now you grow mature enough to start re-evaluating the things you so confidently assert without having actually put in the work to understand them. I hope you do, because otherwise you'll get more miserable if you maintain this attitude to your 30s. With that said, the invitation does remain open for a chat, be it private or in public, about any topic you want, including topics I know nothing about, though should you choose such a topic, you will allow me 2 weeks to get myself familiar with it. I don't expect you to agree with most of what I said. Heck, considering how much lack of temperance you've shown in this video and in the comment section, I would not be terribly shocked if you just tell me to fuck off. What I do expect, though, is that you will reflect on this a few years from now, after the seed of doubt would have started to flourish. And of course, I do expect the rest of the people who will be watching this to be able to take away something from this very long video and use it in the education process of their own presumptuous, impertinent, and flippant teenage daughter or son. So, with all of that being said, if you had managed to watch it until this moment, thank you all for watching. Thank you for your consistent and generous support. And I'll see you all soon on Freedom Alternative.